So I think we will go straight into the discussion panel with Chris. Chris will be chairing this.
It's a great privilege to be able to chair this this discussion panel, and I really want to turn it over to the attendees and as well as the participants who we may have questions for each other really just open up the floor to questions. I suppose the only thing I would say perhaps to frame it is that this session on cultures, in my mind, is very much trying to connect the use of design computation to the way that it's changing our practice. I think that whether you're involved in education and it's about pedagogy, the technology is really just a means to an end, and having that design ambition or having an investigative nose for how, for example, in the presentation that's just been shown, an investigative nose of, well, you know, what does happen in an urban context? What are the morphological relationship between volumes of a building with respect to itself, solar gains, but also the shading and shaded characteristics with adjacent buildings. So really just to open it up to the attendees to post questions. I've got the question and answer box open. I don't see any posted, but if I switch over to the attendees, I suppose the convention would be if you raise your hand and direct the question to the panelist whom you'd like to answer, if you've got a specific panelist to a specific presentation, or whether you'd just like us all to try and answer. So if you want to raise your hand, I'm checking in the Zoom window. Abel, you'll have to tell me if hand raising is enabled or not.
Hand raising should be enabled, yes. Leo, correct me if I'm wrong, but it should be enabled.
Yeah, that's enabled.
And you can just pop a question on the Q&A box, if you like, or even the chat box. I'm checking both, and I think Chris can also see both.
Yeah, I can see the chat box. I can see some of the questions which have been posed. I mean, just to get the ball rolling, I have an open-ended question to all of my fellow presenters on this, which is, what next? I think there's so many suggested ways forward in the conclusions for each presentation, and it's sort of with one eye looking upon next year's conference, Abel. Although I'm sure you're still thinking about coping with the remainder of this one, but genuinely thinking about, you know, what are, in terms of concluding remarks, what are the ways forward, and how. Really an open question to each presenter. What are the next steps? You know, what's the most provocative way forward in a practice, and I would argue a culture of using design computation in practice, in no particular order?
In our case, I think the next step is to kind of align a little bit with Igor and Alvaro, is to democratizing design. That is to kind of to establish some sort of platform that allow, you know, people who, especially in affected regions, to be able to participate in rebuilding their cities. We've run the algorithm, a similar one, to reestablish the city fabric of historic city of Mosul, as a way kind of to build the city in a way that's kind of understand its history, its social structures, and physical historical models. So I would say we would like to move in that direction. That is to allow people build a flat platform, hear from them, and also to better understand the end results and build kind of models that you know, address the issues that we talked about in the paper. Also, prefabrication and would be something that we'd be looking at, creating modular units, minimum inventory, maximum diversity solutions, things of that sort.
just to add to the end of it, it would be great to know what happens afterwards, because I think it's always the case that you analyze what you want there to be sometimes, and your simulation results are very much colored by the question that you pose and the terms of reference you use to assess the simulation's feedback. And then you get to design the actual building, and you go out there with pyranometers and long wave sensors pointing upwards and downwards and try to understand what the net energy balance actually is, and see what actually is the effect in terms of thermal comfort, how many days of very overheated conditions you might have, and perhaps what has the demand been on the air conditioning, if there is air conditioning, or in ice production. I mean, it's a really an informative way of trying to assess the simulation's validity. And I just wonder how that feedback loop feeds into the simulation questions and the simulation parameters. And is there a very conservative view of the world, and is there a very optimistic it's all going to be great view of the world, and how big is that band? I think it's a really interesting question about how do you take the complication out of assembly. That's something that's, I think, in common in all of the presentations, is that there is an ambition to make the assembly unambiguous, or if not unambiguous, make it obvious. And I think it's interesting when you go and look at other territories of design discipline. I mean, I'm thinking in particular the world of automotive, where the Japanese principle of pokiyoki, of having only one way two things can go together, means that in the assembly stage, it's almost like you don't really need the instruction, because the part itself signals to you how it relates to other parts. There's less ambiguity, doing things which have got asymmetric holes and pegs, so it's obvious you can't put it together, and trying to, as it were, design out the need for a lot of instruction, the need for a lot of skill and interpretation of documents, which often aren't there, or they're two sets removed from the person who actually has to carry out the assembly. I don't know if everyone else has other thoughts on this.
I certainly do, but I'll just be quiet for a moment. And I think Igor and Alvaro can talk a fair amount about that, because the work they've been doing is just amazing. And it's very hands-on, right?
Yeah, I think in a way, what's next for us is I would say there are two answers to the question. One is sort of bringing the previous research of previous 3-4 years and on augmented reality assisted fabrication, let's say, to one-to-one architectural scale beyond prototypes and pavilions, which we did in kind of personal projects. So that would be one, trying actually to bring this to the industry and beyond the realm of research projects in academia. And the other one would actually be kind of looking at a different way of applying extended realities in architecture. So rather than being focused only on fabrication or design, it's more about the experiential side of how people could interact with the cities and perceive the cities in different way through extended reality technologies, right? Through kind of series of digital overlays, or something that is kind of probably more closer to understanding of an average person of what augmented reality is, right? Kind of what you could see in the movies with all the digital displays, overlays, heads-up displays, and so on. And that's something that we kind of branched out our research this year at the Bartlett too, kind of looking into how to create different digital platforms and apps for fully immersive experience in the urban environment, sort of like urban games in a way, urban AR games. So I don't know, Alvaro, if you want to add anything.
No, I think you're pretty right. No, like those are the two possible ways. I mean, I would just add that through like together with the one-to-one prototyping comes the idea of platforms. This technology allows for a very different approach to the traditional method of construction, and basically because it allows for unqualified people to get into the building process, it is easier to export everywhere. Like it's not limited. Like, for example, one of the main problems in the hub in developing countries is that the access to qualified people is very difficult. Like, for example, I know a specific paper that talks about the possibility for developing communities to get qualified people in Central Africa because there is no period. So that can also help to increase and to improve building technologies there through this technology, like through augmented reality, because obviously it can skill people that normally have no access to education, and basically a augmented device could be whatever. Like maybe HoloLenses are too expensive or or complex for those areas, but everybody in Central Africa has a smartphone. Literally, like it's the way they work, and those can also have augmented reality, which is fantastic. So I think that can really challenge traditional understanding in that sense.
I don't know if any of the other panelists want to pick up a thread from that as a what's a next step type of provocation. I don't know if Flavian, I think particularly in yours, it's quite a long view. It's taking the very long view of how artificial intelligence and how embodiment is going to evolve on the very, very long view, or perhaps not so long view.
Yeah, I think it's I think time is actually a dimension that we should actually consider when we try to bring these technologies into our working realm. Quite often we are focused on the short-term benefit of either getting someone skilled or trying to have some sort of immediate gain, but this might be traded at the expense of our intelligence, for instance, being conditioned in the long future. And I think what I'm worried at the moment is not of AI replacing our jobs, but actually AI turning us stupid, pretty much. And I think if there's what I was trying to investigate in my paper is whether there's some sort of framework which could actually give something back to the user, and that could actually enable his or hers development. So rather than the human factor just being the actuator of that tool or software, there would also be like some sort of reciprocal relationship where the tool is actually teaching or enabling the user to think in a different way, and that could also have like an impact on the continuity of the profession. But there's always the question of why and who benefits most of using these technologies, whether it's the designers of these. I'm just thinking now, because you've mentioned using AR. Is it the people actually inventing AR benefiting most out of utilizing it, or is it the actual community that is benefiting of it? Who's benefiting of skilling people up? And whether there's some sort of balance. Shouldn't that piece of technology kind of emerge out of the culture of that place, or should it be a different place projecting their own sort of view into that specific context? it's kind of an open question, really.
And an intriguing one.
I just loved Flavian's presentation and the fact that he was decomposing a film to explain a not so far in the future scenario. And what I find interesting is this kind of relationship between the artificial and the organic intelligence, etc. And you did discuss a lot about utilitarianism. I don't know if you came across the utilitarian machine, the utilitarianist machine, I think it's called, which was proposed by philosophers in Cambridge as a response to Jeremy Bentham. And this was very much saying, okay, yeah, what is good is what is the right thing to do is what is good for most people. But imagine there is a machine that makes you feel terrific, but at the same time kills you. So what do you do about that? And as a kind of a collective entity in the planet, this is more or less what we are doing, right? We are doing what we think is for the greater good, but at the same time, we are destroying where we live. And this is home. I mean, we cannot just pack and go to Mars just like that. And it's going to take a little while. Until we get there, we need to make sure that we don't die before. So that's a very tricky situation. But that is a framing of the phenomena. The other thing is the Hegel's phenomenology of the spirit. And in that, he describes something really interesting, which is called the master-slave dialectic. And basically, what he talks about is that when you have a master and a slave, that the game of power end up being symbiotic, because if the slave executes many of the tasks of the master will no longer be able to exist without the slave. And you can reach a tipping point where the slave becomes the master, because the master can no longer survive without the slave. And it's that constant fight between life and death in that symbiotic coupling, that symbiotic relationship. And I think this is very much what you've been showing in the video, and the relationship between David, the android, and its creator. And if that artificial intelligence surpasses the creator's intelligence, we yet fall in that, kind of oscillating homeostasis that starts to exist. What will be the purpose of that android that is an almighty intelligence, if not looking after the master that now became my slave, because cannot exist without the slave? So it can become a kind of double negative for both. So the information that in the intelligence asymmetry can keep that balance going, that oscillation going. So there is no, and that's what we see in the film, right? That's exactly what we see in the film. The sole purpose of the android is to create
perfect entity.
A perfect entity
Perfect
that is engineered to take the place of the master. It's a better version of the master, because the slave has no other option except to look after the master. So it's a very interesting thing. I think it is a kind of, I'm just putting this out there, and I just wonder what you think.
No, I was going to sort of try and posit a completely different line, and maybe this is more trying to take Igor's point directly, which is an architect once said to me that the beginning, middle, and end of your ability to deliver a building that you promise a client has got more to do with the design of the contract for administrating the project than it is for the building that you put forward at the time that the contract's let. And the reasoning for the advice was that if you don't have terms of reference for the participants, contractor, builder, client, you as part of the design team, downstream suppliers, then you don't have a fair or even a quantifiable basis for negotiating the trade space of how much of what, when, put where. And if you lack that, or if there's significant ambiguity, especially in the design documents, you are always fighting a losing battle of ambiguity of intent, ambiguity potentially in costing, because you're not sure what exactly is going where, at what stage in the construction sequence, or exactly how, and this is particularly the case when you're designing every single component bespoke, which is what a lot of design manufacture, even platform approaches tries to do. You don't really have effective terms of reference. So I've sort of, it's a piece of advice which has lived with me for about 20 odd years. And I often look slightly with cynical mindset back at those days when it was explicitly stated. So you were working to, Joint Contracts Tribunal, whatever it was then, 1998 edition. And those were your terms of reference. And I just think in the digital age and in the age that we're going towards, there is still the fundamental problem, I should say challenge, of an appropriate level of abstraction in your representation. How do you get to a point of clarity so that everyone who's involved, whether they are the assembler, whether they are the person costing it, whether they are the person trying to source the machinery needed to make those parts, or whether the person at the point of production trying to assemble something from machined components, choices that are made all along that chain of information translation from a sketch into a CAD drawing, from a CAD drawing into a CAM file, from a CAM file into a piece of metrology planning to establish whether or not your part is what you need it to be within the margins that you can afford it to vary by. That's still the currency of exchange. And it just occurs to me that I don't see that disappearing entirely. I don't see that machine learning is going to just make all of that kind of struggle obsolete. I think if anything, we need to be more circumspect about where we try to put the value proposition. Where are the things that need to join? I'm just thinking of Igor and Alvaro's large-scale freeform timber assembly. The degrees of freedom in jointing one piece of timber just to fix it in three-dimensional space are really large, and that's just one, and they're coordinating with pieces before and after it.
Igor, it's like Chris, I think this is a fascinating point. I just wonder, what I would ask is, and this is also for Mustafa, how accessible was it for novice users of the technology? Because I think, and this varies geographically as well. How easy it is to adopt, because as Alvaro said, you go to Central Africa today, everybody has a smartphone because it's an accessible, powerful device that will, it's our revolutions and fourth industrial revolution's Swiss Army knife. So I'm just wondering how accessible and how easy to adopt the technologies were when you are doing this, if continue from the thought thread from Chris. Does this make sense, Chris?
Yeah, yes, of course, sure.
My reason being, for example, you can have a fancy HoloLens, but you can also have your smartphone and use it as for augmented reality, and it's right there for you. And how does this change, from Baghdad to Central Africa to London to to the different locations we're talking about?
I think. What you want to go?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as we mentioned, right? Yes, we are working with HoloLens, but you can do also a lot of things with your smartphone, and soon enough, hopefully, the AR devices will be so ubiquitous that could just be wearing a normal glasses and they're doing the job. In our case, like when we were doing the steampunk pavilion, like it was actually shockingly easy, right? None of us ever steam bent anything in our life before. Like, yes, we did like a 5-day workshop in Aarhus to test some prototypes, but otherwise no one steam bent anything in their lives before, right? And then we had also a group of friends and volunteers who helped us building, and they all went through the same process, right? They were, you know, most of the people who were working with us, they were totally unfamiliar with the design or, you know, what the process will be, what the process should be. All they needed was, you know, an introduction of how to use HoloLens for half an hour and, you know, go with it. Here's the material and follow the holograms. And, you know, it was as easy like that, right? I mean, you know, it was quite a laborious process, obviously, to build the whole thing. But in that sense that we did not print a single drawing, like we did not even produce a single drawing, except for like the competition, you know, elevation and a section that you have to submit. The only literal thing that we printed was you know, a QR code marker that you had to put to kind of position your model in 3D. And that was it, right? And we essentially managed to build, you know, at that time, the largest structure built purely using the AR assisted fabrication, right? So in that sense, you know, that was kind of, that happened 2 years ago, right? And it was kind of at a very early stage of our research, and it kind of gave us reassurance that this is something that has future and that really has a potential to change the construction industry.
I would say in our case, we are looking or considering the use of smartphones to build kind of a platform, interactive platform that have people to kind of use and explore with. We haven't done that part yet, but this is what we're looking for, is to enable people to interact with and designing their houses. We currently evaluating the result that we are working or that we're getting using space syntax, but definitely to have people be able to use it and to test the usability of the platform is kind of require more work from us. But this is definitely something we're looking at. Mm-hmm.
Sounds like a really interesting research project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I can't. Oh, I see someone raising their hand. First person raising their hand.
Yeah.
Nassar, please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much. Maybe I'll go back to the first question, then I'll back to the current question. The first question about what's next. Our concern, me and Mustafa, is about the future of architecture education, as we are educators. So what's going on in our education, what we are doing with the students. We are speaking about the architects, the current technology in the construction industry. We don't think more about the education, how we prepare our student for these technologies. We have to balance to make sure that our graduate students, they have enough knowledge about the technology, but at the meantime, they should know enough about the architects itself, about the architecture. So this is maybe one of our concern about the future, how to implement what we did in this paper and other papers, as well in the education, how we teach our students the use of these technologies. And this is maybe the next step for our work for the education. And maybe it's open a question for you as well. Maybe you can have an advice for us as we are educators, and maybe most of you are as well. So this may be my main let's say comments.
Well, I'm just looking around the panelists, and I see lots of people who I have taught with, or who I am teaching with. And I would just reflect back that the difference that I think one needs to grapple with is what's a skill and what's a competence. And I think that it's been my observation professionally that you notice skills when they're missing. You ask someone, we're going to design a solar shading system. We have a building that we think is at risk of overheating, and we want to consider the design space for how to protect the building's risk of overheating. You're implying several layers of knowledge. What causes the overheating? It might just be that there's too much glass, or the wrong sort of glass, not enough solar reflective, or potentially too much heat absorbing glass, something that's tinted that actually then re-radiates long wave energy. You're making assumptions about their knowledge of solar geometry and actually what the risk factors are when the solar geometry is at high angle, as distinct from the difference that you get between direct solar radiation and daylight under overcast skies. I can only imagine that a lot of Iraq has quite high levels of straight sunlight and not necessarily a lot of diffuse light. But then you get the issue of, well, what is the ground surface? Because you're getting ground reflected light into the building. So devices that you might extend have unexpected consequences. And all of these things, they're about understanding the context that a building is exposed to and the possible environmental consequences, fabric choices, finishes choices, construction, build-up choices, specification of glass, but then it's also human behavior. Sometimes if the deployment of the shading system is manual, do people understand, does an occupant read from the design of the building how it was intended to perform when there is the risk of overheating? And all of this is packaged as layers. And if someone's asked to do a solar shading scheme, the presumption is that the means, variable performance facade shading, fixed light shelves, or variable height light shelves, those are all means for addressing it. But the actual skill is interpreting the problem, actually understanding the problem specification. And that's where I think if that isn't there, or if that can't be explicated in a student learning context, then you notice the skills absent, because they'll come up with a solution which clearly doesn't address the risk of overheating, or might just unilaterally ignore it. And I think the competence that one wants to build, because you're always recognizing that technology, the means by which you want to do something, is going to evolve. The competency is understanding how to identify the problem and recognize some solutions which are routes to addressing the problem, and perhaps as importantly, routes which are unlikely to make any difference and to, by implication, to be avoided. And I think in an education context, the cultivation of that competence is a problem-solving statement. Have projects which provoke the student to recognize there's a problem. You have to somehow grapple with it. And the skill is, well, how well you do, how well you deploy today's technology, which is going to evolve. But the competence you're trying to build is the problem solving. Actually, I would go before that, the problem identification. And as a lifelong learner, which most of us in education are, my pitch of the geometrical product specification is just the adoption of the means to try to be clear, the means to try to make the manufacturing process more ambiguous, more explicit, actually say these are the things that are important, these are the things that are not so important, don't invest too much time in it. And I think all of those suggestions, all of those routes are really just to provoke a student body to recognize, yeah, we've got really big challenges, they're global. And I think the competency that one would want to cultivate with respect to the technology is, well, test it. How far can you go? And in an environment like the one we teach in, at the Bartlett, testing involves, a lot of risk. Some things don't work very well, but that's just the place to carry out those tests and learn those lessons before they reach the real world where the potential impacts are much larger. Those would be my thoughts. We've got some traffic in the chat window. I'm sorry, I'm still looking at questions and answers and not seeing any, and looking at attendees and no hands going up. There is a question though from Melinda.
Yes, yeah, I think her microphone is not working, but she poses a big question there, right?
If I may, if I just pick the Alvaro, if I just pick the middle question that I see, we're still planning for static physical buildings, constructing with the most advanced augmented reality and virtual reality tools. Isn't it odd to still be making the house as the outcome?
Well, I think yes and no. Like I think there is the need for planning static architecture, but normally it's how we are used to it. But obviously that will change in the future, because probably some situations will have to be more dynamic. Like I'm thinking now in all these areas that they will start to suffer more and more problems with the weather and environment and things like that. They will need to slowly move in. And in fact, there is a very interesting research also at the Bartlett and RC1 that talks about that, and how entire towns will need to move eventually because of climate change and things like that. So it would be an interesting point in that sense. But yeah, I mean, obviously there is a chance for that with the augmented reality to be more, or to be able to design a more dynamic system for architecture. That is definitely a possibility. I totally agree with that. Yeah.
I would just like to add that, in terms of application of extended realities in architectures, I think we mentioned in one of the previous answers in the discussion that it's not purely limited, obviously, to AR-assisted manufacturing, right? That you can understand extended realities also as kind of a way to enhance the space and the way that you use the space, which obviously lends itself naturally to be dynamic rather than a static digital overlay, right? And then to answer the question of isn't it kind of odd to use the most advanced AR and VR tools to make houses? AR and VR tools should, or we expect them to essentially become ubiquitous, right? That they should not be this extremely expensive and unobtainable piece of technology. It's more something that, essentially you have it in your phone already, right? And it's, exactly the way that that could help, for example, resolve the housing crisis, right? Through democratization of the design and fabrication processes and so on. Essentially just making the kind of technology and good architecture more accessible to people than it is at the moment. So why housing? I actually think yes, housing would be a great application for this.
I agree with you, Igor. Yeah, I agree with you guys. Yeah, we can go as fast as we possibly can, and probably we won't have enough housing to accommodate everybody in the world.
We really don't have enough housing. You can see the prices there in London.
Yeah, but in London, it's not the global landscape.
Yeah.
If you're talking, yeah.
I'm going to pick a different track with Melinda's question, because I think it provokes a different line of thinking. The dynamic environment that a building experiences is both diurnal, or at least in the temperate climate zones of the planet, and seasonal. And if you look to the natural world for illustrations of evolution, the overwhelming evidence is that if your environment varies, you vary in a as lighter weight way as you can. And I think you could stretch this the other way, that one of the difficulties in thinking in 4 dimensions about the design possibility, and this applies to a housing as much as Greg's comment that I'll get onto in a second, high-rise office buildings, is that how do you account for a building that's going to be static? And I think that designing buildings that are dynamic, that are operating in response to that diurnal cycle change and the seasonal cycle change is a real challenge. How do you make a building have variable performance on those two different timescales? And truth is, if you go and look at buildings in Australia, for example, you have pretty configurable buildings. They're designed to be fairly large scale fabric changes across seasons, from the high summer to the milder winters, but using technology to visualize what your design options are. In other words, to get the sun path onto a VR or onto an AR display when you're on a site. There's some merit to that, I think, if it influences the design of your building. We're used to seeing building books like, for example, Design for Climate, which is ancient, I suppose, as a book reference. I think it was written in the late 1960s, early 1970s. I still have a copy of it somewhere. It's all about bioclimatic design. But often it's just bioclimatic design with a static building, just being respectful to the variations around it. And I think that advanced design tools sort of provoke advanced design solutions, or should, in my mind. And I think them being dynamic on those two different timescales is something to consider. We've got a question that's come in from our attendees. So Greg's posted a question about the tallest building in London that's gone up, 22 Bishopsgate. For those of you who don't know it, I'm trying to see if I can quickly drop an image into the chat window, if that will work. I'm assuming that most of you know it. Is it going to let me do that? And Greg's questions: why all the boring curtain wall panels and straightforward extrusions? Perhaps this is our last question now that we've just passed 1:30. With all of this design capability, with all of this optioneering that's possible, how come a building like that is a response? I would say it came down to risk management.
Yes.
Of course.
Management, I agree with you, Chris. Management legacy. Going for the try and tested, and maybe supply chains, costing. What do you think?
No, I think also the fact that big companies, they don't want risk. They are doing this for money. They are investing in super expensive land, like in the city of London, and obviously that is extremely safe design. It is possible to make. You're gonna make it, and it's gonna kind of be in the cost range you have predicted. So obviously that is probably the reason, because at the end of the day, big companies, they just see numbers, they don't see design.
I don't know. I think it's a design that looks like it's to maximize, maximize area, maximize office space and so on. But what is sad to see is that you can maximize area and office space and have a beautiful building. You can have a high quality building that is also beautiful and architecturally challenging, or has aesthetic value. It seems to be like an economical exercise. Right.
Well, Greg's comeback's great, and I would use the same terms of reference. They had a different attitude to risk.
Yes. Yeah.
It's not that it's not possible, Greg. I think that it's a case that if you make a mistake, and it's interesting that you picked the walkie-talkie as an example, because the unintended consequence of making, I believe it was a concave geometry, was that it's a gigantic reflective mirror with focal point that moves as the sun tracks across and burning Jaguar cars. I think it was someone's Land Rover. Well, it is Jaguar Land Rover. So, and
that's that star.
It's at whatever it is, 20 odd stories high. And that's an unintended consequence. But I think seriously, that is serious, but seriously from a manufacturing point of view, with those buildings, if you get something wrong, it's going to hurt, and you're going to get it wrong everywhere. And I think the risk analysis becomes that if you do a lot of different things, you potentially are going to you're actually spread betting, getting a lot of things wrong, potentially. I'm just reflecting on buildings that were bold. I'm thinking Centrepoint, late 1960s, Richard Seifert, which was unoccupied for years and years and years because the detailing, and by the way, it's a very repetitive building. And from memory, from the detailed construction sections through the external wall that I've seen, the issue was that rainwater can penetrate upwards. Just because of its location at the intersection of Oxford Street and Charing Cross Road, there just happens to be that you can get an updraft. And under rain conditions, it basically, you had rain penetration into that building because it just wasn't detailed. And they did one detail, used it everywhere. And when it went wrong, that building's been unoccupied for most of the time that I've been involved in this this world.
Yes, I think, Chris, shall we call for final thoughts? I'm just wondering, we're halfway through our lunch break.
Should we go around let's go around the table. I've already talked far too much in no particular order. I don't know. Igor, do you want to go first? Closing remarks, and then Flavian.
Yeah, I don't think I have much to add besides what we said. I think kind of explain how we see the potential of AR technology and extended realities in architecture. And I strongly believe that's sort of a future, right? And but I would just like to stress at the end that we do not see it as kind of alternative to automation, or as an opponent to automation in that sense, but rather the other side of the same coin, right? Where it helps actually bring people and machines together in the design and fabrication process. So actually kind of as something that is enhancing or accelerating the introduction of automation into mainstream industry.
Thank you, Igor. Flavian?
I guess my final thoughts would actually be a question that maybe everyone can reflect upon, is why and how can all these amazing improvements can actually improve our condition, and what's to be gained out of it. Are we becoming smarter? Are we becoming happier? Is happiness the final goal, or is it our development the final goal of learning how to use these tools? But also, who gets to benefit mostly out of software tools and AI? I think it's more of an open-ended question, really.
Thanks, Flavian. Mustafa, would you like to give your concluding thoughts?
Yeah, and I might touch a little bit on Fabian's comment. I think the way I approach it and the project we did is we kind of adding more tools, more kind of intelligent tools to our arsenal. It's not going to replace us as an architects. I don't believe that. I think it is going to make us design maybe more efficiently and maybe more differently. That is, we are not only designing forms, but we are also designing code and algorithms, and the way we can, build things. It might be a little bit different. I also want to comment is this is a fantastic session. I really enjoyed all the presentations here. the way that digital technologies are changing design, the way are considering cultures and usability issues is just fantastic to see the state of that in current academia and practice. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mustafa. I'd echo your thoughts. Zuhair, do you want to give some concluding thoughts?
Yeah, maybe it's very summarized one, and thank you for this session, of course. I'm thinking about what kind of architecture we are aiming for. In current digital era, we are using these digital tools, but we still think about the human being of the human part of this using of these digital tools. Are we designing for construction, industry, or for human? I think we're still focusing more on this part of this, let's say, technology. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zuhair. Yeah, very provocative thing to close on. Alvaro, do you want to give some concluding thoughts?
Yeah, so very quickly to mention that all those technologies, they're just opportunities. Like how we use them, obviously, is up to us. But the good thing is they are there. That we can really choose now more tools from the box. No, like we have more and more options, and they are being implemented slowly, very slowly, but they are being implemented in all the managed architecture, and I think that is positive that we have the option to choose the type of architecture we want to design, which was not that easy before.
Yeah, but it's also like this discussion about the tools is a bit old, no? It's not about the tools, right? You know, the tools have been out there for 20 years already, right? And everyone is kind of already, or should be, beyond that point of being blinded by, you know, NURBs or meshes or this or that or agents, right? That's so ever present now in the design that it's almost like, you know, being literate or knowing how to draw or like write, right? So I do not believe that the discussion should be about the tools, and the discussion is about the tools.
No,
yes, yes. A good question is like, who is it for? Who are the tools for? And you know, the tools can be for the end user, they can be for the designer, could be for the contractor, they should be for everyone, right? Because then what's the point of opening this to everyone if still the tools are a black box, right? Then it kind of defeats the purpose.
Okay, Igor.
Sorry, maybe it was not kind of.
It's a nice provocation. I like it. I like it very much.
I just want to ask Melinda if she's able to, if her mic works, if she's got some concluding thoughts to share. Try the mic one last time. I can't hear it. I can't hear.
No, yeah.
Oh, that's a pity. Sorry, Melinda, but thank you for the comments that you've put in the chat bar. I'd like to throw one last concluding thought. Sorry, Abel, I recognize we're running really long on time. I'll be really brief. I would agree actually with Igor's central point. And I've just, for my part in presenting GPS and being an advocate for it, it would be a mistake to look at it as just another piece of the puzzle to get more efficient and to get that productivity curve to rise. I think that its actual benefit is going to be felt by those who are trying to achieve efficacy, not efficiency. Efficacy, and the distinction being understand need and drive your manufacturing capability to address the need. That's not efficiency. That's like matching means to needs in a much more well-aligned way. And the attributes, the positive attributes of GPS are merely that the information representation of intent is aligned that way. But yeah, been super privileged to be involved in this morning's session, and yeah, no, the presentations were amazing, and I really enjoyed the after show conversation. That's it from me.